Good evening, night owls, and welcome back to Sleepless Politics, the place where the hour is late, the coffee is strong, and the stories we explore are stranger than fiction, yet still anchored in the messy, complicated world of human ambition, deception, and power. Tonight, we're leaving the modern shadows of espionage and heading back to 1894, to France, where the streets of Paris glimmered under gaslight, the salons buzzed with politics and scandal, and a nation teetered on the brink of both moral panic and institutional betrayal. Before we dive in, do one thing for me. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you think about this story. It helps map our network of late-night thinkers across the globe. And if you love the kind of history that keeps you awake at night, hit subscribe. Trust me, you're going to want to see the rest of this. Because tonight, we unravel the story of Alfred Dreyfus, a French army officer wrongfully accused of treason in a scandal that would shake France to its core, reveal the poisonous depths of anti-Semitism, and set in motion a struggle over truth, justice, and national identity that would last for years. But make no mistake, this isn't just a tale about one man, or even one trial. It is a story about how fear can be weaponized, how institutions can betray their own, and how the courage of a few determined individuals can shine a light into the darkest corners of power. It all began in a climate of suspicion and paranoia. France, having suffered defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, had rebuilt its military and its pride, but it remained haunted by fear of espionage. The nation's intelligence apparatus was under constant scrutiny, its officers wary of betrayal. Into this charged atmosphere, a mysterious document appeared at the German embassy in Paris, a memorandum revealing military secrets. The French counterintelligence services, led by Major Hubert Joseph Henry and Colonel Sandher, pounced. They were determined to find the culprit who had dared to compromise France, and almost immediately, suspicions fell on Alfred Dreyfus. Why him? Because Dreyfus was Jewish, because he was Alsatian, because in the fevered logic of the time, he was an outsider in a military establishment steeped in tradition, nationalism, and latent prejudice. The arrest itself was swift, and the process was conducted with a chilling efficiency. Dreyfus, then a captain in the French artillery, was taken from his post and accused of passing secrets to the German military. The evidence was circumstantial, and in many cases fabricated. Handwriting experts offered contradictory reports. Key documents were suppressed or altered. And yet, the machinery of justice moved forward with terrifying momentum. Within months, Dreyfus was convicted of treason in a closed military court and sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island, a remote penal colony in French Guiana. But the story did not end there. While Dreyfus languished in exile, whispers began to circulate. Some officers and civilians, appalled by the injustice, began to question the evidence. Rumors suggested that the real spy remained at large, and that Dreyfus had been sacrificed to protect reputations and maintain order within the army. Letters, memoirs, and investigative inquiries slowly chipped away at the official narrative. Prominent writers, intellectuals, and activists took notice. Among them, Émile Zola, one of France's most prominent literary figures, would take a dramatic step that would ignite the nation, publishing the explosive open letter J'accuse, directly accusing the military of anti-Semitism, cover-ups, and judicial corruption. The Dreyfus affair became more than a court case. It divided families, friendships, newspapers, and the entire French Republic. Anti-Dreyfusards insisted the army's honor must be preserved at all costs, while Dreyfusards demanded truth, transparency, and justice. Public demonstrations, secret investigations, Forged documents and clandestine intelligence became routine. And all the while, Alfred Dreyfus remained on Devil's Island, isolated and suffering, a symbol of human endurance under institutional betrayal. As night deepens, as Paris sleeps beneath the gaslit streets, the tension between truth and power, between justice and prejudice, grows more acute. The Dreyfus Affair isn't simply a historical anecdote. It is a blueprint for how fear, bias, and political expediency can warp institutions, ruin lives, and corrode the very ideals a nation claims to uphold. And it is also the story of courage, resilience, and the slow, arduous pursuit of justice against overwhelming odds. So, sit back, settle in, and pour another cup of coffee. The tale of Alfred Dreyfus is one that will disturb, inspire, and challenge the way you think about power, prejudice, and the human cost of secrecy. And as we move forward, I want you to think about one thing. How far would institutions go to protect their own? The arrest of Alfred Dreyfus in October 1894 was swift, sudden, and shrouded in secrecy, a quiet storm that would soon explode into one of the most infamous scandals in French history. On that fateful morning, Dreyfus, a young, diligent artillery officer, went about his duties unaware of the storm that had gathered around him. Intelligence officers quietly summoned him, citing a matter of national security, and escorted him from his post under strict confidentiality. No one anticipated the full scale of what was about to unfold: a military tribunal, a lifetime sentence, and the irreversible stain of betrayal that would shadow him and his family for years to come. Yet from the very beginning, the machinery of injustice was finely tuned, operating as though the outcome had already been decided. The accusation of treason, rooted more in suspicion and prejudice than in clear evidence, set the stage for a miscarriage of justice that would echo across Europe. From the first interrogations, it became evident that Dreyfus faced not only an impenetrable bureaucracy, but also an environment steeped in latent anti-Semitism. The French military, recovering from the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War, had developed a culture of paranoia, a belief that spies lurked at every corner and that the loyalty of officers could not be taken for granted. Dreyfus, a Jew from Alsace, a region recently lost to Germany, was seen through the lens of suspicion even before a shred of evidence had been presented. Officers who interrogated him believed that his ethnicity, his background, and even his measured demeanor were indicators of duplicity. Each answer Dreyfus gave, calm and factual as it might have been, was interpreted as evasive or insincere. Small gestures were magnified, minor inconsistencies were treated as proof of guilt. The process had little to do with truth and everything to do with maintaining the illusion of control and honor within a fragile military institution. Meanwhile, the evidence assembled against Dreyfus was curiously inconsistent, yet it carried the weight of finality because it came from the very authorities charged with defending France. Handwriting analysis, the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, relied on a document known as the bordereau, a memorandum allegedly written by a spy passing military secrets to the Germans. Experts examined the document and, despite stark disagreements among them, concluded that Dreyfus was the author. Yet many of the analyses were flawed. Samples were incomplete, the methods were rudimentary by modern standards, and biases, both conscious and unconscious, shaped the conclusions. Additional proofs, including Dreyfus's personal papers and testimonies from fellow officers, were manipulated or selectively presented. The trial, held behind closed doors, left no room for public scrutiny, ensuring that only the narrative of guilt would prevail in official channels. The courtroom itself became a theater of intimidation. Dreyfus, alone and isolated, faced a panel of senior officers whose opinions were as much informed by social hierarchy and institutional loyalty as by fact. The trial lasted only a few days, yet its impact would resonate for decades. Every legal maneuver, every procedural step was designed to secure conviction and to protect the military's reputation rather than to seek justice. The defense was hampered by restricted access to evidence, limited opportunity to challenge witnesses, and a pervasive atmosphere of secrecy. Even Dreyfus's own lawyer, fiercely committed though he was, struggled to navigate a system that seemed predisposed against his client. By the end of the trial, the verdict was delivered, guilty of treason and sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island, a remote and harsh penal colony in French Guiana. The sentence was carried out swiftly, stripping Dreyfus of rank, property, and dignity. The man who had devoted his life to serving France, who had risen through the ranks on merit and dedication, was now branded a traitor. Yet even in the shadow of this injustice, murmurs of dissent began to emerge. Some officers and civilians privately questioned the evidence, noting irregularities and inconsistencies that suggested Dreyfus had been selected as a convenient scapegoat. Others feared speaking out, aware that the Army's reputation and their own careers might be jeopardized. Still, the first seeds of the eventual fight for justice were planted, even as Dreyfus endured the crushing isolation of Devil's Island, the sea stretching endlessly around him, and the world believing him guilty of a crime he did not commit. The voyage to Devil's Island was long, isolating, and a cruel introduction to the punishment that awaited Alfred Dreyfus. As the ship cut through the Atlantic waves, he gazed out at the endless horizon, knowing that behind him lay not just his career and freedom, but the social, political, and moral structures of a nation that now deemed him a traitor. The penal colony, remote and inhospitable, was notorious for its harsh conditions, oppressive heat, tropical diseases, and isolation designed to break both body and spirit. Yet Dreyfus, whose character had always been marked by quiet determination and a rigorous sense of duty, resolved not to surrender to despair. He was innocent, and in his heart, he vowed to survive, to endure, and to live to see the truth come to light. The early months on Devil's Island tested him in ways no courtroom ever could. Prisoners were confined in small, damp huts, often in the company of hardened criminals. Meals were meager, sanitation rudimentary, and guards indifferent or openly hostile. Letters from family were sporadic, censored, and delayed for months. Yet amid the isolation, Dreyfus began to chart a new form of resilience. He observed the patterns of the penal system, learned how to manage interactions with guards, and sought small ways to assert his dignity in a place designed to strip it away. Each day became an exercise in endurance, each hour a testament to the belief that innocence, no matter how obscured, could outlast oppression. Meanwhile, in Paris, the Dreyfus affair began to ferment in the public imagination, though many were still unaware of the full scope of the miscarriage of justice. The Army, eager to preserve its honor, maintained a narrative of absolute certainty. Dreyfus was guilty, the trial had been fair, and anyone who questioned it was accused of undermining the nation. Yet cracks were beginning to appear. Certain officers, confronted with inconsistencies in handwriting analyses, suppressed documents, and irregularities in the trial proceedings, quietly began to question the verdict. The notion that a scapegoat had been chosen to protect the reputation of the Army began to circulate in whispers among influential circles, though, publicly, dissent remained dangerous and rare.
At the same time, the Dreyfus family, particularly his wife Lucy and his brother Matthew, began a tireless campaign to prove his innocence. They collected testimonies, pressed lawyers, and sought access to restricted evidence. Each attempt was met with bureaucratic stonewalling and subtle intimidation. But their persistence laid the groundwork for a broader movement that would, in years to come, challenge the very foundations of the French military establishment. The Dreyfus family's determination exemplified a crucial truth. The fight for justice often begins with the courage of a few who refuse to accept falsehood, no matter the cost. Even as the physical isolation of Devil's Island threatened to erode his strength, Dreyfus found solace in small intellectual pursuits. He read extensively, practiced mathematics, studied military strategy, and maintained meticulous records of his thoughts and observations. In these acts, he preserved a sense of agency, a mental fortitude that allowed him to endure both the injustice of his sentence and the daily hardships of the penal colony. Letters smuggled or delayed sometimes provided glimpses of the outside world, hinting at early investigations, discussions in legal circles, and the growing murmurs of doubt among a select few who still believed in his innocence. The injustice of the trial, combined with the extremity of the punishment, created a pressure cooker that would ultimately ignite a wider reckoning. In hindsight, these early years on Devil's Island can be seen as both a crucible and a catalyst. While designed to break Dreyfus, they also solidified his resolve, fostered the moral clarity that would define his eventual vindication, and set the stage for the explosive public debates that would envelop France in the coming decade. Across the Atlantic, across the courts, and in the salons of Paris, the seeds of resistance, investigation, and outrage were quietly germinating, awaiting the moment when truth would collide with entrenched power in a public and historic reckoning. By the end of these first harrowing years, Dreyfus had transformed from a wrongfully accused officer into a symbol of endurance, integrity, and the struggle against institutional corruption. His innocence had become a moral imperative, and his story began to resonate with those willing to question authority, challenge prejudice, and confront the uncomfortable realities of a nation unwilling to face its own failings.
While Alfred Dreyfus endured the punishing isolation of Devil's Island, the world beyond slowly began to notice inconsistencies in the case that condemned him. The initial months after his conviction were dominated by the army's assertion that justice had been done. Yet, for those who paid attention, the evidence against him was fragile, contradictory, and in some instances clearly fabricated. Among the first to raise questions were junior officers and clerks in the French general staff who had observed gaps in the investigation. The so-called bordereau, the memorandum that had been central to Dreyfus's conviction, did not match Dreyfus's handwriting with the certainty the court had claimed. Moreover, reports that were convenient. By 1898, the Dreyfus affair had shifted from a military scandal to a national crisis. While Dreyfus suffered on Devil's Island, a single act of moral courage would ignite the conscience of France and push the nation to confront the corruption, prejudice, and institutional failures at the heart of the case. That act came in the form of Émile Zola's open letter, J'accuse, published on January 13, 1898, in the Paris newspaper L'Aurore. Zola, already a celebrated novelist, understood that words had the power to reach beyond the closed walls of courtrooms, military offices, and political backrooms. With precision, eloquence, and fury, he accused the French army, the judiciary, and high-ranking officials of deliberately suppressing evidence, fabricating documents, and condemning an innocent man to protect the institution's honor. The letter was explosive in both content and tone. Zola named names, citing officers he alleged had falsified evidence or obstructed justice.
He denounced the pervasive anti-Semitism that had facilitated Dreyfus's conviction and highlighted the human cost of bureaucratic arrogance. Zola's words were not merely an intellectual exercise. They were a direct challenge to the power structures of France, an invitation for citizens, lawyers, and journalists to examine the miscarriage of justice. J'accuse transcended the Dreyfus affair itself, becoming a manifesto for truth, morality, and accountability in the public sphere. The response was immediate and polarizing. Newspapers loyal to the army or conservative elements condemned Zola as a traitor to France, accusing him of undermining national honor. Anti-Dreyfusard politicians demanded his prosecution for libel, while patriotic societies denounced him from the platforms of salons and theaters. Yet, simultaneously, Zola's letter electrified supporters of Dreyfus. Intellectuals, academics, and ordinary citizens who had previously been uncertain or silent now found a rallying cry. The term Dreyfusard became shorthand for those willing to challenge authority, pursue justice, and confront anti-Semitism. Émile Zola's intervention also reshaped the legal and political landscape. Though Zola was eventually tried and convicted of libel, forcing him into temporary exile in England, the impact of J'accuse could not be undone. The French public was now forced to confront the contradictions in the army's narrative. How could an innocent man be condemned so swiftly? Why had evidence implicating Esterhazy been ignored? How could a judicial system permit such secrecy and suppression in the name of protecting institutional honor? For many, the moral imperative was clear. The truth could no longer be hidden behind military prestige or nationalistic rhetoric. The Dreyfus affair, once a confined military scandal, now dominated headlines, salons, and parliamentary debates. Every new piece of evidence, every anonymous tip, and every legal challenge intensified the national conversation. Public demonstrations in Paris and other cities became commonplace, with Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards often clashing in the streets. While violence was rare, the tension was palpable. Families, friends, and communities divided along lines of principle, prejudice, and loyalty. Intellectuals debated the meaning of justice, while ordinary citizens struggled to reconcile their love of country with the glaring evidence of injustice. At the center of this maelstrom was the growing awareness of systemic anti-Semitism within French society. The army's eagerness to convict Dreyfus, despite flimsy evidence, exposed a deep cultural bias that resonated far beyond the military. Jews were consistently portrayed as outsiders, disloyal, and inherently suspect. The Dreyfus affair forced France to confront its own prejudices and the dangers of allowing societal bias to influence institutions of power. Meanwhile, efforts to secure Dreyfus's release intensified. Lawyers, journalists, and sympathetic officers compiled reports, submitted petitions, and collected eyewitness testimonies that had been overlooked or suppressed during the original trial. They highlighted the inconsistencies in handwriting analyses, pointed to Esterhazy as the true culprit, and challenged the military court's procedures. Slowly, but inexorably, the walls of secrecy and denial began to crack, although the army and conservative elements continued to resist, framing the issue as one of national honor rather than justice. Zola's letter had changed the rules of engagement. No longer could the Dreyfus affair be confined to the closed halls of the military tribunal. It had become a national debate over morality, justice, and identity. France was now forced to choose between blind loyalty to institutions and an unwavering commitment to truth. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not only Dreyfus's fate, but also the moral direction of the entire republic. The publication of Zola's J'accuse ignited a chain reaction that would ultimately expose the real traitor, Major Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy, and intensify the fracture within French society. Esterhazy, a charismatic but morally dubious officer, had been implicated from the earliest stages of the investigation, yet the military had suppressed the evidence pointing to his guilt. His letters, handwriting samples, and suspicious connections were dismissed or buried, as convicting him would have meant admitting the army had been wrong and Dreyfus innocent. The cover-up, like a tightly wound spring, was beginning to unravel under public scrutiny and relentless investigation. In the months following Zola's publication, Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picard's meticulous work came to light. Picard had risked everything by secretly gathering evidence linking Esterhazy to espionage activities for Germany. He documented discrepancies in military communications, cross-referenced handwriting samples, and carefully noted Esterhazy's suspicious access to sensitive documents. Despite facing forced reassignment and ostracism within the army, Picard's determination created a growing body of irrefutable evidence. For the first time, a narrative began to emerge that suggested Dreyfus had been wrongly accused and Esterhazy was the actual traitor. The revelation of Esterhazy's guilt did not immediately resolve the crisis. Rather, it intensified the divide between the Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards. The army, embarrassed but resolute in preserving its honor, attempted to suppress the evidence and protect its hierarchy. Conservative newspapers vilified anyone supporting Dreyfus, accusing them of attacking France itself. Political factions seized upon the scandal to advance agendas, with right-wing groups emphasizing national unity and military prestige, while liberals and intellectuals demanded justice and accountability. The public debate became a battlefield where ideology, religion, and prejudice clashed, often as fiercely as political arguments. Esterhazy, shielded by powerful allies and the inertia of institutional self-preservation, appeared untouchable. His trial, when it finally occurred, was a farce in the eyes of many observers. Witnesses were ignored, evidence minimized, and the judgment heavily influenced by entrenched military authority. In contrast, Dreyfus, imprisoned thousands of miles away on Devil's Island, remained powerless, his innocence known to a few, but dismissed by the very institutions sworn to uphold justice. Public opinion, however, began to shift subtly. The seeds planted by Zola, Picard, and Dreyfus's persistent family members began to bear fruit, awakening a collective conscience among those willing to confront systemic failure. Meanwhile, the intellectual and literary community continued to exert pressure. Émile Zola's exile may have removed him physically from Paris, but his writings circulated widely, inspiring both outrage and reflection. Other Dreyfusard supporters published detailed analyses of the trial, documented the inconsistencies, and drew attention to the military's failures. These efforts coalesced into an informal network of advocates, journalists, and legal experts, each contributing to a growing understanding that Dreyfus's conviction was a miscarriage of justice rooted in prejudice and institutional fear, rather than solid evidence. The anti-Dreyfusards, in turn, doubled down on their position. They framed any defense of Dreyfus as unpatriotic and dangerous, portraying the army as infallible and accusing the Dreyfusards of undermining national stability. Religious tensions exacerbated the divide. Catholic conservatives, wary of secular intellectual influence, often aligned with anti-Dreyfusard rhetoric, while secular liberals emphasized reason, justice, and moral responsibility. France, once united by a shared sense of national pride, was now cleaved by ideology, social identity, and competing visions of honor and truth. In this climate, the political stakes could not have been higher. The Dreyfus affair was no longer simply a question of one man's guilt or innocence. It had become a lens through which the values of the entire French Republic were scrutinized. the nation was forced to grapple with questions about anti-Semitism, the limits of institutional authority, the role of public opinion, and the meaning of justice in a modern society. Even ordinary citizens, previously indifferent, began to take sides, recognizing that the outcome would reverberate far beyond the courtroom.
The Dreyfus Affair did not end with Alfred Dreyfus's exoneration in 1906. Instead, it became a defining moment for France, shaping political culture, legal reform, and the public's understanding of justice for generations to come. The case exposed the profound vulnerability of institutions to bias, secrecy, and political expedience. While Dreyfus himself regained his rank and honor, the broader societal wounds remained raw. Anti-Semitism continued to simmer, militaristic pride remained strong in certain factions, and the struggle between truth and institutional self-preservation persisted as a cautionary tale. Schools, newspapers, and salons debated the implications, and intellectuals used the affair as a lens to examine civic responsibility, ethics, and the necessity of transparency in public life. One of the most profound consequences of the affair was the crystallization of the Dreyfus-Ard movement as a moral and political force. Figures like Émile Zola, George Picard, and countless lawyers, journalists, and ordinary citizens had demonstrated that collective advocacy, grounded in evidence and principle, could challenge the most entrenched institutions. Their work laid the groundwork for a civic culture that valued accountability and the protection of individual rights, even in the face of overwhelming institutional opposition. The Dreyfusards had not only fought for one man's innocence, but had also reshaped societal expectations of justice, showing that societal pressure could compel reforms and prevent future miscarriages of justice. Legally, the Dreyfus Affair prompted significant reforms in French military and judicial procedure. The case revealed flaws in evidence handling, secret courts, and the manipulation of expert testimony, emphasizing the need for transparency and independent oversight. Courts became more accountable, and public scrutiny of military and political decision-making increased. These changes, though incremental, reflected a growing recognition that justice could not exist in isolation from public awareness and ethical obligation. The notion that institutional prestige could override moral responsibility had been dramatically challenged, and France began to confront the dangerous consequences of allowing secrecy, prejudice, and fear to dictate outcomes in matters of life and liberty. The affair also left a lasting imprint on political and social discourse. Anti-Dreyfusard rhetoric, grounded in nationalism, Catholic conservatism, and anti-Semitism, highlighted persistent societal tensions, while Dreyfusard arguments, emphasizing reason, morality, and human dignity, offered a counterpoint. The polarization of public opinion foreshadowed conflicts that would erupt in later decades, demonstrating the enduring challenge of reconciling ideology with justice. For the public, the case became a moral mirror, reflecting both the failures and the potential of civic society, a society capable of both deep prejudice and extraordinary courage, capable of complicity and heroism, sometimes simultaneously. On the international stage, the Dreyfus Affair became a symbol of the dangers of institutional secrecy and societal prejudice. Intellectuals across Europe and the Americas studied the case as an example of how judicial and military institutions could be manipulated to serve social or political ends. Discussions of civil rights, minority protection, and judicial transparency often referenced Dreyfus, illustrating that the lessons of the affair extended far beyond France's borders. His ordeal became a case study in law schools, a topic for political debate, and a cautionary tale for governments seeking to balance national security with ethical governance.
Alfred Dreyfus himself, despite years of suffering and exile, emerged with remarkable resilience. He returned to military service, participated in World War I, and remained a figure of moral authority in France until his death. His experience became emblematic not only of endurance under injustice, but also of the transformative power of truth, advocacy, and collective moral courage. Dreyfus's story reminded France and the world that the defense of justice is not a passive endeavor, but an active struggle. The formal exoneration of Alfred Dreyfus did not instantly heal the fractures within French society, but it marked the beginning of a slow, profound transformation. Across the nation, debates persisted about justice, institutional authority, and the role of conscience in shaping public life. Families, friends, and colleagues who had once been divided by ideology now faced the uncomfortable task of reconciling their perceptions of patriotism with the reality of wrongful conviction. For some, the exoneration was a triumph of truth over prejudice. For others, it was a bitter acknowledgement of institutional failure, a stain on the honor they had been taught to revere. Yet regardless of personal alignment, the Dreyfus affair had irrevocably altered the French moral and political landscape. One of the most significant outcomes was the growing awareness of anti-Semitism as a pervasive societal issue. Though prejudice had existed long before the affair, the public scrutiny that the case demanded forced many to confront the consequences of systemic bias. Newspapers, public lectures, and essays analyzed the subtle and overt ways in which anti-Jewish sentiment influenced decision-making, particularly within the military. Political leaders and reformers began to advocate for legal protections and reforms to prevent future miscarriages of justice grounded in ethnicity, religion, or social background. The conversation about identity, prejudice, and fairness became central to civic life, ensuring that the lessons of Dreyfus's ordeal would resonate for decades. The impact on the French military was equally profound. The affair exposed glaring weaknesses in internal oversight, evidence handling, and accountability. While the institution initially resisted reform, the prolonged public scrutiny made it impossible to maintain the appearance of unblemished honor without genuine change. Policies were revised, training for officers was improved, and procedures for evaluating evidence and conducting courts-martial were re-examined. The Dreyfus affair, therefore, served as both a cautionary tale and a blueprint for institutional improvement, demonstrating that transparency and accountability are not optional in systems that wield power over life, liberty, and reputation. In the cultural realm, the affair inspired countless novels, plays, essays, and debates, cementing Dreyfus as both a historical and moral symbol. Writers explored the psychological impact of wrongful conviction, the complexities of loyalty and courage, and the tension between public duty and personal morality. The affair became a reference point not only for legal scholars and political activists, but also for artists and intellectuals seeking to grapple with the human consequences of injustice. Across Europe and beyond, Dreyfus's story highlighted the precarious balance between individual conscience and institutional authority, leaving an indelible mark on the cultural imagination. Alfred Dreyfus himself, now restored in rank and honor, remained a quiet yet potent presence in French public life. He continued to serve in the military during World War I, his sense of duty undiminished by the years of suffering he had endured. Yet Dreyfus's personal narrative became inseparable from the broader narrative of justice, courage, and resilience. His experiences inspired subsequent generations to question authority, demand transparency, and recognize the moral imperative to act even when doing so entails risk. The man who had once been confined to an isolated penal colony had become a symbol of human endurance, the embodiment of the principle that truth can outlast oppression. The affair also reshaped public discourse around the relationship between the press, intellectuals, and political institutions. Emile Zola's intervention demonstrated the power of a single voice to influence public opinion and challenge entrenched power. Newspapers, pamphlets, and books became instruments for both advocacy and accountability, underscoring the necessity of free expression and holding institutions to moral and legal standards. The case revealed that the press could serve as a counterbalance to secrecy, providing citizens with the information necessary to demand justice and question authority. Internationally, the Dreyfus Affair became a reference point for discussions about minority rights, judicial transparency, and institutional accountability. Intellectuals and policymakers outside France studied the affair as a cautionary tale, a vivid example of how prejudice, secrecy, and hierarchical power could combine to produce injustice. Legal reforms, civil rights discussions, and the moral arguments made by Dreyfusards influenced broader conversations about governance, human rights, and ethical responsibility, demonstrating that the implications of one case could extend far beyond national borders. Ultimately, the Dreyfus Affair remains a The final chapters of the Dreyfus Affair unfolded with a mixture of triumph, reflection, and enduring tension. After years of relentless advocacy by Dreyfus's family, supporters, and intellectuals, the French Supreme Court annulled the original conviction in 1906, formally restoring Alfred Dreyfus to his rank and reinstating his honor. The legal conclusion, though delayed, symbolized a profound moral victory, the acknowledgement that truth and justice, even when suppressed for years, could prevail against entrenched prejudice and institutional obstinacy. Dreyfus returned to France, no longer a prisoner, but a living testament to human resilience, his endurance a stark contrast to the arrogance and moral compromise displayed by the institutions that had condemned him. Yet even with formal vindication, the emotional and social scars remained. For Dreyfus, the years on Devil's Island and the public humiliation had left an indelible mark, shaping his perspective on loyalty, justice, and the human cost of institutional failure. His personal experiences underscored a broader societal lesson that innocence alone is insufficient to shield one from the consequences of systemic prejudice and bureaucratic expediency. The army and the judiciary had proven capable of immense error when motivated by fear, honor, or social bias, and the public had learned firsthand how society can be manipulated by ideology and misinformation. The divisions within French society, meanwhile, persisted long after Dreyfus's exoneration. The anti-Dreyfusard faction, rooted in nationalism, conservative Catholicism, and entrenched social hierarchies, continued to resist full acknowledgement of wrongdoing. For them, the affair remained a painful reminder of the perceived threat to national honor posed by questioning military authority. Conversely, Dreyfusards celebrated a moral victory, advocating for reforms in law, governance, and education that would reduce the likelihood of future miscarriages of justice. The affair's polarization left a lasting imprint on political discourse, shaping debates over secularism, civil rights, and the role of public opinion in governance for decades. One of the most enduring impacts of the Dreyfus Affair was its influence on intellectual and cultural life. Writers, philosophers, and journalists used the case to explore questions of morality, identity, and justice. Emile Zola's intervention in particular demonstrated the extraordinary power of the written word to challenge entrenched authority and mobilize public sentiment. His courageous act of speaking truth to power became a model for activism, journalism, and moral responsibility, showing that intellectual engagement could have tangible consequences for legal and political systems. The Dreyfus Affair, therefore, became more than a historical event. It became a moral and cultural touchstone, studied for lessons on ethics, civic duty, and the interplay between society and institutions. Internationally, the affair resonated far beyond France. Observers in Europe, the Americas, and even colonies under French influence followed the case, noting how prejudice and institutional rigidity could subvert justice. Dreyfus became a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience, a single individual whose ordeal revealed the fragile balance between law, ethics, and social power. Governments, scholars, and reformers examined the case as a study in institutional failure, exploring how public oversight, intellectual intervention, and civic activism could correct systemic injustice. It became a reference point for human rights discussions and legal reforms, influencing debates about transparency, minority rights, and the role of the press in democratic societies. Alfred Dreyfus's later life reflected a quiet dedication to duty and moral principle. Though he no longer faced the isolation and injustice of Devil's Island, he remained committed to public service, participating in military duties during World War I and engaging with social and civic causes. His presence was both symbolic and instructive, a living testament to endurance, integrity, and the capacity for truth to prevail, even under the most oppressive circumstances. His experience demonstrated that moral courage, sustained advocacy, and unwavering adherence to principle could reshape not only individual fate, but also national conscience. The broader societal impact of the affair continues to resonate. The Dreyfus Affair exposed how prejudice, secrecy, and the protection of institutional prestige can corrode justice, while also illustrating how persistent advocacy, public awareness, and intellectual courage can overcome entrenched bias. It reminds us that injustice is never merely a private matter. It implicates society, institutions, and the moral fabric of a nation. Dreyfus's story is a testament to the human capacity for resilience and an enduring call to—
Even after Alfred Dreyfus's formal exoneration, the reverberations of the affair continued to ripple through French society, shaping politics, culture, and public consciousness. The affair had exposed the vulnerability of institutions to bias, prejudice, and the corrupting influence of a rigid hierarchy, but it also revealed the capacity of ordinary citizens, intellectuals, and advocates to demand accountability. France, in the years following Dreyfus's return to honor, was a nation divided, yet awakened. Conservatives remained skeptical, insisting that the army's prestige had been imperiled, while liberals and Dreyfusards argued that justice, transparency, and the rule of law were essential pillars of a modern republic. This tension influenced political debates, elections, and the press for decades, marking the affair as a turning point not only in Dreyfus's life, but in the trajectory of the French nation itself. Dreyfus's own reflections during this period revealed a man profoundly aware of both his personal ordeal and its societal implications. Writing letters and memoirs, he expressed gratitude for those who had fought for his innocence, while acknowledging the suffering he had endured. He also articulated the broader moral lessons of the affair, that truth could triumph over secrecy, that courage could pierce even the most entrenched institutional barriers, and that systemic injustice, if unchecked, could poison the conscience of an entire nation. Dreyfus's words resonated with audiences far beyond France, influencing reform movements, legal scholars, and political thinkers who saw in his experience a template for confronting injustice wherever it appeared. The cultural and literary landscape of France was profoundly influenced by the affair as well. Writers and journalists continued to chronicle the Dreyfus Affair, exploring themes of morality, identity, prejudice, and the tension between individual conscience and institutional authority. Plays, essays, and novels drew inspiration from the drama of wrongful conviction and public resistance, reflecting society's ongoing struggle to reconcile its ideals with its actions. Intellectuals debated the responsibilities of citizens, the dangers of conformity,
and the ethical obligations of those who wield power. Through literature and journalism, the affair became embedded in the French consciousness as more than a historical event. It became a moral touchstone, a reference point for debates about justice and civic responsibility. Internationally, the Dreyfus Affair had far-reaching implications. Scholars, activists, and governments studied the case as an example of both the dangers of institutional secrecy and the power of civic engagement. Dreyfus's ordeal became a symbol of resistance to systemic oppression, inspiring discussions on judicial transparency, minority rights, and the ethical responsibilities of public officials. In legal circles, the affair prompted analysis of evidence handling, procedural fairness, and the role of public scrutiny in maintaining the integrity of judicial outcomes. Across continents, Dreyfus became emblematic of the universal struggle for justice, illustrating that moral courage can transcend borders and resonate across cultures. Meanwhile, France itself underwent subtle but significant changes. Public awareness of anti-Semitism, previously confined to elite circles, spread into mainstream discourse, provoking debates about social prejudice, citizenship, and the rights of minority communities. Schools began teaching civic responsibility and the dangers of blind institutional loyalty. Newspapers published exposés on corruption and bias, and political reformers used the Dreyfus Affair as a case study in ethics and governance. Even military institutions, though slow to change, were forced to reevaluate internal processes, oversight, and accountability measures to prevent future miscarriages of justice. In essence, the Dreyfus Affair became a catalyst for institutional and societal reflection, demonstrating the long-term power of moral vigilance. Alfred Dreyfus himself became a symbol not only of resilience, but of the complex interplay between individual agency and societal responsibility. His personal courage, the advocacy of supporters like Émile Zola, and the public's eventual recognition of injustice collectively reshaped the landscape of French law, politics, and culture. Dreyfus's life illustrated that truth and integrity, though often challenged, have the capacity to endure against formidable opposition. The lessons of his ordeal extended beyond legal exoneration, emphasizing the necessity of moral courage, public advocacy, and vigilance in confronting systemic failure. The story of Alfred Dreyfus also underscores a timeless principle, that justice is never guaranteed. It must be pursued, defended, and sometimes demanded with persistence and bravery. Institutions, no matter how venerable, are fallible, and societies that fail to confront their own prejudices risk perpetuating cycles of injustice. The Dreyfus Affair remains a cautionary tale, reminding future generations that the pursuit of truth is not merely a legal matter, it is a moral imperative, one that requires the vigilance and courage of both individuals and communities. Even today, as we reflect on the night of injustice, the trial, and the eventual exoneration, the lessons of the Dreyfus Affair resonate. Unchecked prejudice can destroy lives. Institutional pride can conceal wrongdoing. And moral courage, often at personal risk, can restore integrity and justice. It is a story that transcends time, reminding us that vigilance, truth, and after his formal exoneration and restoration to the army in 1906, Alfred Dreyfus returned to a France that had changed as much as he had. Though the courts had cleared him of all charges, the psychological scars of a decade-long ordeal were deep. Years of isolation, public vilification, and betrayal by institutions that should have protected him had left an indelible mark on his character. Dreyfus understood better than anyone that justice was not automatic, that societal prejudice could override truth, and that courage and persistence were essential tools for survival. Yet, paradoxically, his years of suffering also forged a man of extraordinary resilience, capable of patience, reflection, and moral clarity. He resumed his duties with dignity, participating actively in military affairs while continuing to advocate, quietly but persistently, for integrity within the armed forces. Dreyfus's personal reflections, preserved in letters, memoirs, and conversations with confidants, reveal a man acutely aware of the broader implications of his ordeal. He recognized that his case was never just about him. It was a mirror reflecting the fragility of institutions, the dangers of prejudice, and the moral responsibilities of citizens in a democratic society. His writings convey an understanding that the battle for justice does not end with one legal victory. It is a continuous struggle against complacency, secrecy, and the subtle forms of bias that permeate society. In this sense, Dreyfus became not only a symbol of endurance, but also a moral philosopher whose lived experience illustrated lessons in courage, conscience, and the societal consequences of injustice. Publicly, Dreyfus's reintegration into French society was a complex affair. Supporters celebrated his return and recognized him as a moral hero. Yet, anti-Dreyfusard elements remained vocally opposed, refusing to acknowledge the army's failures or their own complicity in a miscarriage of justice. Political debates in the Chamber of Deputies, newspapers, and salons reflected this ongoing tension. Anti-Semitic rhetoric persisted, though its visibility and acceptability were increasingly challenged by Dreyfusards and intellectuals committed to civil rights and transparency. The case had, in effect, transformed French political discourse, embedding moral inquiry, accountability, and the responsibility to challenge authority into the national consciousness. Dreyfus also became a living reminder of the role of civic action in shaping justice. The combined efforts of his family, journalists, lawyers, and intellectuals had forced institutions to confront uncomfortable truths. Émile Zola's J'accuse had not only galvanized public opinion, but had shown that the pen could challenge the sword, that moral conviction could cut through bureaucracy and prejudice. Dreyfus's case demonstrated that a society unwilling to confront its own failures risked perpetuating injustice, and that public engagement is not optional. It is necessary for the preservation of both justice and democracy. Internationally, the Dreyfus affair continued to resonate as a cautionary tale. Scholars, politicians, and activists across Europe and the Americas studied the case as an example of systemic failure and the power of civic intervention. It influenced discussions on minority rights, judicial transparency, and freedom of the press. The story of an individual wronged by both prejudice and institutional self-interest became a universal reference point for debates on human rights, the ethical responsibilities of governments, and the mechanisms necessary to prevent abuses of power. Dreyfus, once a prisoner and public pariah, now stood as a figure whose life experience transcended national boundaries, offering lessons for governments, courts, and citizens worldwide. Culturally, the Dreyfus affair left a lasting imprint. Writers, artists, and playwrights explored the psychological, social, and ethical dimensions of the story, transforming the events into a subject of ongoing reflection. The narrative was retold, analyzed, and dramatized, ensuring that its lessons remained vivid and accessible to subsequent generations. Educational institutions began to incorporate discussions of Dreyfus into curricula on law, ethics, and modern history. By linking the experience of a single individual to broader societal principles, the affair underscored that morality, justice, and civic responsibility are not abstract concepts. They are lived realities whose neglect can result in profound human suffering. The exoneration of Alfred Dreyfus did not mark the end of the social and political turbulence the affair had unleashed. France, still reeling from the scandal, was forced to confront the consequences of a decade-long injustice that had polarized a nation. anti-Dreyfusards, who had staunchly defended military authority and questioned the legitimacy of the retrial, continued to exert influence in politics, shaping debates about national loyalty, military honor, and the role of intellectuals in public life. Yet, the growing presence of Dreyfusards, writers, academics, and activists, ensured that the principles of justice, transparency, and equality remained central to national discourse. The Dreyfus Affair had, in essence, transformed French politics into a battleground where ideology, morality, and institutional authority collided, creating a tension that would persist for decades. Politically, the affair catalyzed reforms aimed at preventing future miscarriages of justice. Public oversight of military courts increased, and mechanisms for evidence review and judicial accountability were strengthened. Laws regulating transparency, press freedom, and civil rights were influenced by the public outcry and sustained advocacy that had characterized the Dreyfusard movement. The affair exposed the dangers of secrecy and unchecked authority, demonstrating that even respected institutions could perpetuate grave injustice if left unchallenged. In the aftermath, France began to reconsider the balance between national security, institutional discretion, and the fundamental rights of citizens, laying the groundwork for modern legal protections and ethical standards in governance. Culturally, the Dreyfus Affair remained a defining touchstone. Writers, journalists, and philosophers analyzed the ethical, psychological, and social dimensions of the case, transforming it into a permanent subject of study and reflection. Émile Zola's role as a moral provocateur became legendary, inspiring future generations to challenge power and demand accountability. The affair's depiction in literature, plays, and essays highlighted the human cost of prejudice, the fragility of justice, and the importance of courage in confronting institutional failure. For artists and intellectuals, Dreyfus's story was both a warning and a call to action, a reminder that societies must be vigilant if they hope to protect both individual rights and collective morality. The affair also prompted France to grapple with the persistence of anti-Semitism. Though Dreyfus's exoneration was a legal victory, it did not erase the societal prejudice that had facilitated his wrongful conviction. Public debates, newspapers, and scholarly works increasingly examined the social, political, and religious roots of discrimination. These discussions led to gradual but important changes in attitudes and policies, promoting the idea that legal equality and social acceptance were inseparable from the pursuit of justice. Dreyfus's experience illuminated the insidious ways in which bias could infiltrate institutions, influencing decisions, corrupting judgment, and endangering lives. Internationally, the Dreyfus Affair became a model case study in the consequences of institutional failure. Across Europe and the Americas, legal scholars, politicians, and civil society organizations examined the mechanisms that had allowed an innocent man to be condemned while the real traitor remained free. Debates emerged on the importance of independent courts, judicial transparency, and protections against prejudice. Dreyfus's ordeal illustrated that the rule of law is only as strong as the society that enforces it, and that moral courage and public scrutiny are critical components in safeguarding justice. The affair's global resonance reinforced the notion that individual injustice can illuminate systemic flaws, prompting societies worldwide to reflect on their own vulnerabilities. Moreover, the Dreyfus Affair left an enduring ethical legacy. It demonstrated that morality and law are inseparable. A legal system that ignores human dignity or allows prejudice to influence decisions cannot claim legitimacy. Dreyfus's struggle symbolized the intersection of personal integrity and collective responsibility, showing that both are necessary for a just society. Ordinary citizens, lawyers, and journalists were reminded that inaction in the face of injustice is a form of complicity, and that sustained advocacy can alter the course of history. In this sense, the affair transcended its historical context, becoming a timeless lesson in civic duty, moral courage, and the vigilance required to maintain justice. It was a lesson that would echo throughout the 20th century and beyond, influencing the moral and political debates of generations. As Alfred Dreyfus aged, his life became a living testament to both the fragility and resilience of justice. He did not retreat into bitterness, nor did he allow the injustices he endured to harden his worldview. Instead, he embodied a quiet dignity that reinforced the ethical lessons of his ordeal. That enduring moral courage and steadfast adherence to principle could transform not only individual fate, but the conscience of a nation. He participated in military service during World War I, witnessing the chaos of another conflict. Yet his experience of wrongful conviction remained a constant guide for reflection on authority, ethics, and the treatment of those under institutional power. Even decades later, Dreyfus's story continued to be cited in legal, political, and philosophical discourse as a warning against the dangers of unchecked power and systemic bias. The Dreyfus affair's influence extended beyond France, providing a framework for evaluating human rights and judicial integrity around the world. Legal scholars studied the case as a template for reform, highlighting how evidence mishandling, institutional secrecy, and prejudice could devastate lives. Civic organizations invoked Dreyfus as a moral symbol when advocating for minority protections, anti-discrimination laws, and transparent judicial practices. His experience underscored a universal truth that systems of authority must be continuously held accountable, and that moral courage is essential not only for those wronged, but also for those who witness injustice and refuse to remain silent. In this way, the story transcended national boundaries, becoming a global emblem of the struggle between conscience and authority, truth and institutional pride. Dreyfus's personal narrative also left an indelible imprint on French cultural consciousness. Writers, playwrights, and intellectuals continued to explore the psychological and ethical dimensions of his ordeal, producing works that examined the moral cost of prejudice, the consequences of blind loyalty, and the courage required to challenge systemic corruption. The case became a recurring motif in literature and public discourse, serving as a lens through which successive generations could interrogate social, political, and institutional morality. Through this cultural legacy, Dreyfus's story evolved into more than a historical event. It became a symbol of the enduring human struggle for justice in the face of entrenched power. Politically, the Dreyfus affair reshaped the French Republic's approach to governance and civil rights. The scandal exposed vulnerabilities in the army and judiciary, compelling reforms that increased transparency, accountability, and public oversight. These structural changes, while gradual, reflected a broader societal acknowledgement that justice could not be subordinate to prestige, ideology, or institutional inertia. Public awareness of anti-Semitism, previously a muted social current, became a topic of active debate and scrutiny. Dreyfus's exoneration symbolized a victory not only for him personally, but for the principle that equality before the law must be maintained, even against entrenched social, political, and cultural pressures. The ethical and philosophical lessons of the affair also extended to civic education. The Dreyfus affair became a case study in schools, universities, and law programs, teaching students to critically examine institutional authority, societal prejudice, and the ethical obligations of citizenship. Young lawyers, journalists, and civil servants studied the case to understand how systemic failures could occur and how persistent advocacy and public scrutiny could correct them. In classrooms, Dreyfus's story exemplified the intersection of morality, law, and civic duty, ensuring that the lessons of his struggle were transmitted to future generations who might face similar challenges in entirely different contexts. Internationally, the affair remained a cautionary tale for nations grappling with issues of minority rights, judicial corruption, and institutional accountability. Governments and civic organizations invoked the Dreyfus case when designing reforms aimed at preventing miscarriages of justice, promoting transparency, and safeguarding civil liberties. His experience demonstrated that the abuse of power can happen anywhere, but so too can moral courage, public advocacy, and the eventual triumph of truth. By exposing the fragility of justice in one country, Dreyfus's story served as a moral compass for societies around the world, underscoring the universal importance of vigilance, conscience, and integrity. Ultimately, Alfred Dreyfus's life and the affair that consumed France for more than a decade exemplify the profound human cost of injustice and the
In the years following his exoneration, Alfred Dreyfus lived quietly, but with a profound awareness of the lessons his ordeal had imparted to society. France, still wrestling with the social and political tremors of the affair, was gradually learning to balance institutional authority with public accountability. The military, once nearly untouchable, now faced scrutiny from both the government and the public. Courts became increasingly conscious of the dangers of prejudice influencing judgment. Dreyfus's struggle had exposed the weaknesses of the very systems meant to uphold justice, and demonstrated that no institution is immune to error when human bias is allowed to dictate outcomes. Citizens, intellectuals, and reformers had realized that safeguarding justice required constant vigilance, and Dreyfus's life had become a living testament to the moral and ethical responsibility of society to correct wrongs and protect the innocent. Dreyfus himself remained a moral anchor in a nation that had seen the worst of institutional arrogance and societal prejudice. His letters and speeches, though measured, reflected a deep understanding of how systemic injustice operates. Secrecy, hierarchy, fear, and bias combine to subvert truth and perpetuate suffering. Yet he never allowed bitterness to cloud his judgment. Instead, he emphasized the need for reflection, accountability, and reform. His personal conduct, dignified, disciplined, and principled, served as a silent but powerful critique of the forces that had once conspired to destroy him. In this sense, Dreyfus was not merely a survivor. He became a teacher, a moral compass whose life offered guidance to those navigating ethical dilemmas in law, politics, and public service. The Dreyfus affair had also catalyzed intellectual and cultural reflection. Writers, philosophers, and historians dissected the case for decades, exploring the moral failures that allowed an innocent man to suffer while the true traitor walked free. Schools began incorporating the affair into curricula, using it to teach students about civic responsibility, critical thinking, and ethical leadership. The case became emblematic of the principle that individuals must act when they perceive injustice. Civic organizations, newspapers, and emerging human rights groups frequently cited Dreyfus when advocating for transparency, equality, and protections for vulnerable populations. Through these discussions, the story of Alfred Dreyfus became a universal parable, a demonstration that truth, moral courage, and public engagement can challenge entrenched power, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Internationally, the affair reverberated as a cautionary tale. Countries facing questions of judicial integrity, minority rights, and institutional accountability referenced the Dreyfus affair in both public debates and policy formation. Scholars studied how social prejudice could influence courts and armies alike, while activists and reformers highlighted the necessity of free press and civic oversight. Dreyfus's case transcended national boundaries, serving as a moral touchstone and a blueprint for resisting injustice. Across Europe, the Americas, and beyond, Dreyfus became a symbol of the ethical responsibility each citizen holds to challenge corruption,
expose prejudice, and demand accountability when systems fail. By the time of his death, Alfred Dreyfus was widely recognized as both a symbol and a moral agent in his own right. The man who had endured isolation, public vilification, and systemic betrayal had become a figure of enduring dignity, demonstrating that personal integrity, courage, and patience could overcome even the most entrenched injustice. His legacy was not limited to the legal victory that restored his rank and cleared his name. It encompassed the broader societal transformations his struggle had inspired: institutional reform, public awareness of prejudice, and a heightened appreciation for moral courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. Ultimately, the story of Alfred Dreyfus reminds us that justice is never automatic. Institutions can fail, societies can be blinded by ideology, and prejudice can distort truth. But moral courage, persistent advocacy, and the collective will of society can restore integrity. The Dreyfus Affair stands as both a warning and a lesson that the pursuit of justice requires vigilance, the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, and the understanding that one individual's suffering can illuminate the path toward. Decades after the Dreyfus Affair, its impact on French society and the world remained profound. The case had fundamentally reshaped the understanding of justice, morality, and civic responsibility, leaving an enduring imprint on political institutions, legal practices, and cultural discourse. France, once divided by ideology and prejudice, had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the fragility of its institutions and the dangers of unchecked authority. The army, the judiciary, and political elites had all been exposed as fallible, capable of both error and manipulation. Yet the affair also demonstrated the transformative power of civic engagement, journalism, and intellectual advocacy. Citizens, writers, and thinkers realized that active participation and moral vigilance could compel institutions to confront their failures and correct their mistakes. In this sense, the Dreyfus Affair became both a historical lesson and a blueprint for ethical governance, illuminating the responsibilities of individuals and societies alike. Culturally, the affair continued to resonate. Playwrights dramatized the injustice and courage it entailed, journalists analyzed its lessons for public morality, and historians debated its broader significance. The Dreyfus Affair became a recurring reference point for discussions on human rights, anti-Semitism, and the ethical obligations of authority. It showed how public opinion, when informed and mobilized, could serve as a corrective to institutional wrongdoing. Schools, universities, and legal academies incorporated its study into curricula, teaching future generations the importance of moral courage, vigilance, and the defense of justice. The case became a touchstone not only in France, but internationally, cited wherever injustice or prejudice threatened the integrity of institutions. Politically, the lessons of Dreyfus influenced legislation and reform. Judicial procedures were scrutinized and improved, oversight mechanisms strengthened, and protections for minority communities slowly expanded. Anti-Semitism, while far from eradicated, became a topic of public debate and legal consideration in ways that had been impossible before the affair. Military procedures were reformed to prevent the misuse of authority and ensure that accusations, evidence, and trials were subject to rigorous scrutiny. By exposing the consequences of institutional arrogance and social prejudice, the affair created a precedent that echoed across the legal and political landscape of France, reminding both leaders and citizens that justice requires accountability at every level. Internationally, the Dreyfus Affair served as a moral exemplar. Legal scholars, human rights advocates, and politicians studied the case to understand the dangers of unchecked institutional power. It demonstrated how systemic prejudice, secrecy, and hierarchy could combine to produce grave injustice, and equally, how public advocacy, intellectual courage, and collective moral action could restore it. Across Europe, the Americas, and even colonial territories, Dreyfus became a symbol of the human capacity to confront entrenched authority and demand ethical governance. His story illustrated a universal truth that justice is neither automatic nor guaranteed, and that it requires both the vigilance of society and the bravery of individuals to be sustained. On a human level, Dreyfus's experience underscored the enduring moral lessons of resilience, patience, and principled courage. He demonstrated that one person's suffering, when witnessed and amplified by conscientious allies, could catalyze societal transformation. His life reminds us that injustice, no matter how deeply embedded, can be challenged and corrected, but only when ordinary people are willing to confront authority, advocate for truth, and insist upon accountability. Dreyfus's courage became inseparable from the courage of those who supported him, illustrating the collective dimension of moral action. The affair also left an indelible mark on French identity. It forced the nation to confront the fragility of its institutions, the persistence of prejudice, and the tension between tradition and justice. The Dreyfus affair became a touchstone for debates about civic duty, national honor, and the ethical responsibilities of both leaders and citizens. It reminded France and the world that moral courage is not merely a personal attribute, it is a societal necessity. The lessons of the affair would inform discussions of justice, civil rights, and institutional reform for decades, shaping the moral and ethical frameworks of nations beyond France. Ultimately, the Dreyfus affair is not only a story of injustice, courage, and redemption, it is a story of society itself. It teaches that vigilance, advocacy, and ethical commitment are essential to prevent abuse of power, that truth, though often obscured, can prevail, and that moral courage, sustained by collective conscience, can transform societies. Alfred Dreyfus's ordeal, once again.
And there it is, Night Owls, the full arc of the Dreyfus affair, a tale of injustice, courage, societal reflection, and enduring moral lessons. Alfred Dreyfus, once imprisoned and vilified, emerged as a symbol of resilience and integrity, teaching us that truth and justice require both individual bravery and collective vigilance. If this story kept you awake tonight, thinking about how societies can both fail and redeem themselves, drop a comment below. Tell us what struck you most. Was it Dreyfus's personal courage, the power of Zola's words, or the enduring lessons for modern justice? And don't forget to subscribe to Sleepless Politics. Stories like this, where courage challenges secrecy and conscience confronts prejudice, are why we stay awake, digging into the past to understand the present. Remember, the night may be long, but truth and moral courage are longer, and their lessons last a lifetime.